So our last speaker for the morning session is Amy Keister. She has a very short bio. She is the GIS coordinator for the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint. The South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint is a living spatial plan to conserve natural and cultural resources for future generations. It identifies shared conservation priorities across the South Atlantic region. I'm going to let Amy tell us a little bit more about that.
Might need some help with the mic. Is it on?
I'm going to let you.
Where's the on?
It looks like it was on.
Can you guys hear me? Is the mic on? Okay, excellent. Thank you.
I think if you hit the button on the top, it'll go from orange to green.
Aha! Does that help?
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, I apologize. I didn't get my bio in, but I'm the GIS coordinator for the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative. And I was a late addition to this session, and I wasn't quite sure from the audience if people would know what the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative is. So does anybody raise your hand if you've heard of us before? Okay, so we got some people in here that know, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do some of my background slides before we get into the GIS stuff, and we'll see how far we can get to get into the cool GIS stuff. I definitely want to do a live. I want you to be able to watch me do GIS like Dan did, but I didn't prepare for that. So, the South Atlantic, so just kind of an outline of my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit background about what we are and the processes that we use. We have three main products that we deliver. We have indicators, we have the state of the South Atlantic, and we have a conservation blueprint. And then hopefully if we have time, I'm going to get into talking about people who are using the blueprint, how we develop the blueprint, and how we get it out to our cooperative. I think that's hopefully the stuff you guys are going to be most interested in. And so the South Atlantic Landscape Conservation Cooperative is a partnership. And so we are a forum in which federal and state agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and communities all come together to develop a shared vision for landscape sustainability in our region. And then as a partnership, we cooperate in implementing that vision and applying it out on the landscape and then refining it over time. And a quick note of why we're cooperating. It's not a big surprise to anyone anymore. The agencies in the LCC realized that the future changes that are coming are bigger than any one agency can take on by themselves. So here in the Southeast, we have a lot of projected urbanization, we have projected climate change, we have sea level rise. Any one of our conservation partners can't come up with strategies alone to deal with those issues, and so that's why they developed this cooperative. And so we are an independent, self-directed cooperative in the South Atlantic region, but we don't stand alone. And so we're part of a larger network of 22 other LCCs across North America, the Pacific, and Caribbean islands. And so we're working internally as a self-directed partnership. We're also working across our boundaries with other LCCs to try to create products that match up across boundary lines. And then we also work with other big regional partnerships who are working on future changes. And so we work with the USGS Climate Science Centers, the NOAA RISAs, and the USDA Climate Hubs as well. And we are governed by a steering committee. And so here we have the logos of all of our current steering committee members. And so these are the people who give us our broad general direction on what we should be working on. And that's very important in our model. And so when we come up with our conservation blueprint, it is not the blueprint of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission or the Fish and Wildlife Service. It is the vision of the cooperative together. That's a big part of our model. We have 7 full-time staff that support this cooperative. And one of the interesting things about how we're funded is we're funded by our cooperating agencies. So some of us are Fish and Wildlife Service funded, some of us are USGS funded, Park Service, we have some NC State employee, but we're all working together to serve the cooperative. And then also the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission provides us with our office space as a contribution. And so our big mission in life, why we exist, is we are here to facilitate conservation actions that sustain natural and cultural resources guided by a shared adaptive blueprint. And you can see on this map, we cover a large portion of North Carolina, but we also cover portions all the way from southern Virginia into northern Florida in the coastal plain and Piedmont regions. And when we talk about that shared adaptive blueprint, that is the living spatial plan that identifies the best places for shared conservation actions to sustain our natural and cultural resources in the face of future change. And so we kind of have three major categories of how the blueprint is being used. And the first one is we're using the blueprint to amplify existing conservation efforts. So before the LCC was ever dreamed up, there were organizations and people working on conservation on the ground in our region, and we want to help them support what they're doing. Most of the time they know what they're doing, they know what needs to be done. We want to help them get funds and help them continue to do their work. And so one example of this is, I'm sure you all know we have a lot of longleaf pine in our region. It requires fire to be maintained. And so we've been able to help attract resources to fund maintenance of longleaf pine through fire. And so this example, this was a Department of the Interior funding opportunity. It was called the Wildlife Fire Resistance Landscape Program. So far, we've been able to get about $2 million to directly support fire maintenance on public, private, state, fed, nonprofit lands in our region. And we were able to do that. You'll notice that most of the funding actually went out west because they have a lot of catastrophic fires out west. But through the strength of our partnership and being able to explain how managing with fire is directly impacting our ecological integrity and our cultural resources, we were able to attract some of that funding, and we want to continue to do that in the future. We also want to help our partners in our organization anticipate and plan for change. So we all know that the next natural disaster is coming. We just don't know where it's coming. And a lot of times when these natural disasters happen, you have a limited amount of time to figure out how to allocate your money for conservation. And so we want to plan in the future, be prepared for when that happens. So one example here is NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Association. This was after Hurricane Sandy. They recognized they wanted to be prepared for a hurricane, and so they wanted to do an assessment of coastal communities across the Southeast and of habitats across the Southeast and figure out what are our highest priority areas if another natural disaster hits. So the LCC was able to work with NIFWIF. We provided them our regional planning products, like our blueprint and our indicators. We are also able to help them identify local communities and conservation organizations in the Cape Fear watershed so that they could do a rapid assessment and a prioritization for their project. So again, we want to help plan for future change. And then finally, another big category of what we want to do is we want to be able to adapt the work that we're doing based on changing circumstances. And so the example that we have here, one of our partners was, he works on dam removal. He was very familiar with western North Carolina. He tended to focus his projects in that region. He knew that area. There were a lot of pristine streams there that he could help with dam removal. But by doing some of our regional planning, he was able to identify other places to work that were actually helping connect aquatic connectivity even better than some of the places he had traditionally been working. And so here we're adapting and changing the kind of conservation actions that we take based on new information. And so that's another big way that the blueprint is being used. And so I was very excited to hear Carter talk about fail early. That's also our process. And so we use the lean startup method, and I want to talk a little bit about that and how we work with our cooperative. So people know about lean startup, failing early, or these things I'm sure you guys have heard before. And so lean startup is basically just adaptive management. It's something that we're all familiar with. But the focus is you want to go through your adaptive management cycle as quickly as possible and get out of the planning stage and spend as much time as you can in the revision process. So again, we want to get products out to people. And I really loved what you were saying, Carter, about the goal is not to just do our plan and then get it out. The goal is for people to use the plan. And so we have to have that feedback loop. Is this spatial data actually useful? If not, how do we change it? How do we deliver it in a way that you can use it to actually impact conservation on the ground? And so that's our way of working. And in order to do that, we work really extensively with our cooperative. And so we already talked about the steering committee. We get our general strategic guidance on what we're supposed to be doing from the steering committee. But you all could be members of our cooperative, and we go out, reach out to our cooperative at every stage of the game. So in the planning and figuring out what indicators we want to use, in revising our indicators, in revising the blueprint, in revising the tools we're using to deliver these spatial data sets, we're working with our partners to get feedback and find out what works, what doesn't work. And so I've mentioned this a couple of times. We have three main products that we create. We have indicators, we have the State of the South Atlantic, and we have the blueprint. And so really quickly, indicators are our foundational spatial data sets. And with our indicators, we're attempting to represent both ecological integrity and intact cultural landscapes. And so that's what we're using to measure what the state, like what the ecosystem is like right now. And I'll talk more about indicators later on, but that's the foundation of all the work that we do. And then we use our indicators to make our other two products. And so first of all, we have the State of the South Atlantic. So in 2015, we created a document called the State of the South Atlantic. Forgot to bring my extra copies, but if you get a hold of me, I can get you a copy if you want one. And in here, we've used our indicators to give ourselves a score across our whole region and across subregions of how are things going, how are our ecosystems and our cultural landscapes doing. And so in 2015, we gave ourselves a score of a C. We want to redo this again in 2018 and see how things have changed over time. And then the final product that we have is probably our biggest product, and that's our conservation blueprint, this living spatial plan, help identifying the best places to take conservation action in the face of future change. And so you'll see here we're on Blueprint 2.1. So again, we're trying to iterate quickly. We're trying to get products out and get feedback. And so we had Blueprint 1, Blueprint 2, Blueprint 2.1 that you're seeing right now came out last August. A draft version of Blueprint 2.2 is going to come out in a couple of weeks, God willing. And then we'll have a final version. After the draft version comes out, we're going to go on a road show. We're going to do workshops, work with all of our cooperatives to get feedback on the draft, take it back to our steering committee, make any updates that we get, and we'll hope to get a final product out in the summer of this year. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we build that blueprint. And again, we build it with our indicators. And our first step is we break down our landscape into really broad ecosystem types. So broad definitions like beaches and dunes, upland hardwoods, pine and prairie. And then we try to make indicators that indicate the ecological and cultural integrity of those systems. We also have a category of ecosystems that go across those other ecosystems. We call them cross-ecosystem indicators. And those fall under categories like landscapes, freshwater, aquatic, and waterscapes. And we use those to capture functions that aren't limited to one ecosystem. So we need structural connectivity linking across ecosystems. We need freshwater aquatic services happening across ecosystems. And so we try to get about 3 indicators per ecosystem, and we want them to represent different portions of that ecosystem. And then we spatially model these indicators, working extensively with our cooperative. Our goal is to use existing spatial data where possible. We don't want to be recreating data if we don't have to. And right now we're working at a 200-meter pixel size. And again, we review all these indicators through our cooperative. And then we have to put them together to make the blueprint. And so the way that we do that is, again, we have our indicators by ecosystem, and we have to figure out how to use those to prioritize the landscape. And we chose a conservation software package called Donation to do that optimization. And there's a couple of different algorithms that software will run. And the one that we're using, it basically assumes anything that was identified as an indicator is important. And so ideally, we conserve everything. And then it goes through analysis and says, of all of the pixels that are there, which is the least important, it kicks that one out, and it keeps on going. And so the result is just a continuous raster that ranges from 0 to 1. 1 is your most important area, 0 is your least important area. So it's kind of optimizing the landscape based on those indicators. Then we also wanted to do some connectivity. We wanted to provide a measure of structural connectivity. We used a package Linkage Mapper, which is a tool that you can get with ArcGIS. And we identified core areas from those zonation runs. So what are those really important areas, large contiguous patches of important areas based on the indicators. We also added in some public lands. If it's already protected, we want to try to maintain that protection. And then we tried to calculate corridors in between those big contiguous patches through this least cost path analysis. And so the result is our final blueprint. And in that blueprint, we've prioritized the landscape. And so out of the entire geography, our entire area, 50% of it we have identified as some type of importance in the blueprint. And so the places that were identified as the top 10% based on our indicators are our highest. And then we also have a high priority, which is the next 15%. We have medium priority. Those are usually targets for restoration. They might not be in the best condition now, but with effort we could get them in good condition. And then corridors, also another target for restoration. They might not be the highest priority now, but we need to maintain those areas for connectivity purposes. And so hopefully really quickly I can go through an example of how this happens. Here's just forested wetlands. So again, we cookie cutter up the landscape. Here are forested wetland pixels, 200 meter size. For forested wetlands, we have a couple of specific indicators for the forested wetlands. We have PARCAS, the forested wetland priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas. These were a layer that was mostly expert driven, and they've identified areas that they think are important to sustain populations of these important amphibian and reptile populations. We also have another indicator, forested wetland bird index. This is largely based on patch size, but we use some other landscape characteristics to identify the most important places for forested wetland birds. We also use all of our landscapes, our waterscapes, and our freshwater aquatic indicators in each of our zonation runs in order to optimize that landscape. And again, we just get this result that ranks forested wetlands from 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest priority areas. We do that for all of our ecosystems, and then we add that together. I wanted to point out one thing that people often ask us about. There's a couple of different ways that you can optimize the landscape. And so one way might be, in this example, let's say we have our species in the column over here. Those are, we would call those our indicators, but if we think of them as species, sometimes it's a little easier to understand. Then we have our different sites, or our pixels. And so one way to optimize and prioritize the landscape is just find one pixel that represents all of my species. And so if we were to do that, we would choose these sites 1 and 3 because they have the most species per site. We chose not to use that method for prioritizing because if we did that, our species 2 would drop entirely out of the priority. And so our indicators, since they're supposed to be representing unique portions of that ecosystem, we don't want to lose any one indicator. And so instead we're using this idea of complementarity. And so we're trying to find pixels and sites that have that represent all of our indicators, not just one site that grabs a bunch of indicators, but we don't want to lose any of our indicators. And so that's a question that often comes up. So again, Blueprint 2.1 is available now, and 2.2, a draft version, will be coming out in a couple of weeks. And so now, with my remaining time, I wanted to show some of the ways that we allow people to access data. And so we have 2 main platforms where people can get a hold of this data. The first one is what we call our Conservation Planning Atlas. The public-facing side of that is built off of Databasin. So have you guys familiar with the Databasin platform, anybody? And so that was, when we first started the LCC about 4 or 5 years ago, we knew we needed to get spatial data out to people, and we also knew we didn't want to build anything ourselves, because that's one of our key guiding principles is we don't want to duplicate work that's already been done. And so we analyzed, as a cooperative, we looked at the available places where we could serve out data, and Databasin was the platform that we chose. So this is the public side of this platform. We also use ScienceBase, a USGS platform, to actually store all of our data and to create our map services. And so when you go to the Conservation Planning Atlas, you're on Databasin, but all of the data that you're viewing are being served out by Sciencebase. And that allows us to meet federal regulations for our data management plan. And we really do like the Sciencebase platform. They do a great job of helping us manage our metadata, package up all of our stuff, and get it available to our partners. And so this, Databasin, it's kind of like a poor man's GIS. People, they don't have to have GIS on their machine, but they can open layers, they can stack layers, they can swipe back and forth between layers, they can print off maps. That was one thing that a lot of our partners wanted. A lot of times when we start thinking about this stuff, we start thinking about they want to do analysis on the fly. And then when we used to talk with our users, they're like, I want to be able to print a map and show it to my supervisor. And so we had to really change our expectations of what we made based on our user feedback. But even after we had got a lot of user feedback for our Conservation Planning Atlas, when we took it out to our users, there were people who were overwhelmed by layers, and I have to turn some on, and I have to turn them off, and what am I looking at, and where do I find things? And in response to that feedback, we made another viewer, and that's the simple viewer. And in here, there's no multiple layers. All you see is the blueprint, but we've analyzed most of our important data by HUB 12 watershed and summarized it with charts and graphs. And so that way people, they don't have to turn layers on and off, but they can get to that information using the simple viewer. And if the internet is working, I wanted to try to demo a little bit of how the simple viewer is working. I don't know if do we have internet? Okay, let's see. Let's see if it opens up. Should I agree? I don't know, it's wanting to connect to the convention center. Maybe if I go back. Close the PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Oh, we're still seeing the PowerPoint. Aha. There we go. Thank you all. Sorry about that. So here's our simple viewer. I just kind of wanted to show you an example of what you can do here. People can come in. Most of the people are looking at a particular area, so they can zoom into their particular area. And then again, we've summarized our priority data sets by HUB 12 watersheds. And so when you click on a watershed, you can find out how much of that watershed is in the different priority categories in the blueprint. You can find out how we've defined those categories. But most importantly, people usually want to say, why did you say that's a priority? And so here we can go into our ecosystems and indicators. And so we know that this watershed, it's mostly forested wetland. And we're like, well, why is it important? It's not important for forested wetland amphibians, but it is important for forested wetland birds. So over half of this watershed has been identified as the highest category for forested wetland birds. And so based on our indicators, we think that this should be able to support Swainson's warbler, prothonotary warbler, northern parula, and a large suite of forested wetland birds. And then if you wanted to dig further and find out how did you create that indicator, I don't trust you, I don't believe you, we can switch you over to the Conservation Planning Atlas, and you can read the metadata on how we created that indicator. And then you can give us feedback on whether you think that's correctly representing this landscape. And so you can look through the landscape indicators that also contributed to that score. Then we've also done some kind of simple stuff. We show land cover changes in the past and predicted changes over time. And so we have the NLCD just summarized for these watersheds. And then we have an urban growth projection. And so if it's projected, I'm trying to get over to a more urbanized area. But here we go. And so if it's projected to have more urban growth, we've shown what land cover you're going to lose if those places are developed. And then it's a place where people can try to find partners, find out, is this already protected? Is it in federal ownership? Is there a lot of places that aren't conserved? Is this a place where I want to spend my conservation dollars? So kind of a quick view of how that simple viewer works. And pretty much most of what I have, I did want to say that we're working across LTC boundaries, especially in the Southeast. With this project, the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. And so people like North Carolina, you're not covered by our entire geography, but we're working with Appalachian LCC so that you have products that expand across the whole state. And then just wanted to sign off with how to get involved in the cooperative. You can go to our website, you can become a member, and you can explore the blueprint and all these tools online. So pretty much all I have for you today. Do you guys have any questions?
I noticed the offshore waters are highly rated conservation value, and I was wondering if that was kind of unique to the South Atlantic, or is that something that all the regions are?
That is unique to the South Atlantic and one of the Alaskan LCCs. And so since we're a self-directed partnership, we vary on how much we go into the marine environment. And so our partnership decided to go all the way out to the EEZ. So we go 200 nautical miles into the marine environment. And we use indicators like marine birds, marine mammals, sea turtles, and then we also have some potential hard bottom habitat indicators that we use to try to prioritize our marine environment. And so we have a lot to improve in the marine environment, but using this kind of lean startup method, we're trying to get data out there, get feedback from people. But yeah, that's a little bit unique to us, and we'll see how other LCCs go in the future. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Yes, so we update annually, and so that is our plan. That's what we've been doing for since we created the first version of the blueprint. In these workshops that we're having this spring, we're going to be asking our users about the update schedule to see, is that what you prefer? You want us to keep with this annual update? Do you want us to slow down a little bit? It's kind of a trade-off because you want to get the most recent data you can, but then we want to hear back from our partners, is this disruptive to have an update every year? What schedule? We hear a lot when we first started, people were like, we need it more often than 10 or 20 years. Because we see a lot of plans where it's like, here's a plan, and then people go away, and it never gets updated, and it's irrelevant after 5 years. And so we know there's a certain timeline where we can't go that far. But we're interested in seeing feedback from our users of what update cycle is good. So what update cycle would you like?
I think annual.
Yes.
Because the data are so dynamic.
Right.
You go into it that you're doing it every 2 years, 5 years, or long.
Right. Yeah.
Other conservation mapping like North Carolina, so it's like an interval that is
Yes. Yes. That's good feedback. Yeah, Doug?
Do you anticipate going to a higher resolution on your food system estimated?
Yes, we definitely want to go to a higher resolution, and we're thinking about starting to experiment with that, not in version 2.2, but in the next version. And so we're kind of thinking about this idea of having like the difference between small updates and big updates. And so we'll continue to have an annual cycle where things get updated. But in the meantime, as we're doing that annual cycle, we'll start planning for 2 or 3 years out and start planning with things like updating pixel size. Like once you create this beast, it's very hard to change. And so we have 30 different indicators. And so if we want to decrease the pixel size, we need to decrease the pixel size for every one of those freaking indicators. And so you'll probably be doing a lot of that, like get 3 or 4 indicators done 1 year. And so we might not be able to decrease the pixel size all in 1 year. We'll have to kind of iterate through. But yeah, we definitely want to improve our resolution. Yes?
And so you mentioned in the beginning how various partners are using data. Is this type of funding for more partners than you showed? There was indication that this would be used throughout South Atlantic or federal funding.
Yeah, so we're trying to use it to attract grants. I don't know what, tied to funding. So can you explain more what you mean by tied to funding?
Something I recall.
Yes.
blueprint
I'm with you.
to various grant funding programs where, you have, this is a high priority, you get more.
Right. I'm with you, yes. And we are continuing to work on that. And so we kind of ran into, like we wanted to get in with the NRCS USDA programs, and we ran into a little bit of a block because they have kind of 3 different levels that they do scoring. So they do local scoring, statewide scoring, and then big regional scoring. And so because we didn't cover the whole state, we couldn't get into the statewide scoring system, so we could get into the big regional scoring system. But now that we have CCAS and we have a draft blueprint that goes across the whole Southeast region, we think we're going to be able to get into the statewide scoring, and that's going to be a big bonus for us. And I failed because Dan didn't put the blueprint in his analysis for the Sentinel landscape, so I'm going to have to, if we could bar the doors and don't let Dan and Casey leave, we got to get the blueprint into their we got to get the blueprint into their prioritization as well. So yes, we are trying to work to embed this information into programs like that that are funding conservation on the ground. That's a high priority for us. Any other?